So MMT at a fundamental level is describing what countries that have monetary sovereignty can or cannot do when it comes to national priorities. So maybe it's helpful to start explaining what does a country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty. So if you have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, it means you can issue your national currency, and that is something that most countries around the world can do. Number two, it's a country that collects taxes and fees in that same national currency. And that's something, again, that most countries can do, including in the global south. But this is where things start to get different between advanced, countries with a high degree of monetary sovereignty and developing countries that don't have that high degree of monetary sovereignty. Number three is when a country is not compelled to issue debt denominated in a foreign currency. So think of the United States, for example. The entire national debt stock is issued and is denominated in US dollars. The entire Japanese national debt, which is one of the countries with the largest debt to GDP ratios in the world, in the history of the world, actually. Japan's debt stock is denominated in Japanese yen. So those are countries that have high degree of monetary sovereignty, whereas developing countries, most of government debt is denominated in foreign currencies, and that weakens the degree of monetary sovereignty. And then number four, finally, which is related to number three, is the fact that when you have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, you're not compelled to fix your exchange rate to the US dollar or to the euro or to any foreign currency. And this is something that you see in the United States, for example. The US is not obligated or compelled to stabilize its exchange rate against any other currency. And it's not because it's the reserve currency of the world or whatever. There are other reasons. Other countries who are not reserve currency countries also are not compelled by economic pressures to stabilize their exchange rate, whereas developing countries are almost systematically compelled to do that, which limits the degree of monetary sovereignty and the degree of economic sovereignty, and kind of rewires your entire economic priorities to prioritize economic activity that is extractive, that is actually reproducing colonial structural traps. So to me, MMT is like the lens that allows you to identify which countries have that high degree of monetary sovereignty and therefore economic sovereignty, and therefore a larger fiscal policy space to invest in national priorities, and which countries are constrained structurally and are forced to basically throw their own people under the bus in the process of trying to reproduce structural economic traps that they're unable to undo unless you identify the strategic areas that will allow you to acquire a higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty. So the big misunderstanding that a lot of observers who are not, didn't bother really to look at the details of the MMT theory, saying, okay, so you're saying these countries that have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, they can just print money and spend left and right on all the priorities and have, big wars and big deficit spending without any consequences. They say this is ridiculous, it's going to cause hyperinflation. And that is not what the MMT has ever said. If anything, MMT economists are actually obsessed with the risk of inflation when the critics say, oh, MMTers don't care about inflation. If anything, MMT says countries with any degree of monetary sovereignty, before they deficit spend, what they need to do is identify the inflation pressure points that they have in their economy. And the inflation pressure points, or the risk of inflation, is always determined by two key factors. Number one, it's the availability of real resources in terms of physical resources, productive capacity, skills, labor skills and the labor force, logistics, supply chain disruptions related to that particular sector. Those are the real constraints, because when you deficit spend and increase demand in those areas, if your productive capacity, logistical capacity, labor capacity is unable to keep up with the additional demand, then you will face inflation pressure in that particular sector. But the good news about productive capacity and logistics and all of that is that productive capacity is producible. So you can invest strategically to increase the productive capacity. And that gives you a larger deficit spending capacity, a larger fiscal policy space. So that's half the story. That's the inflation risk that is determined by productive capacity type of things. The second thing that determines the risk of inflation is what I call abusive market power and price setting behavior. That is, if you have key players in your economy, domestically or internationally, that can raise prices simply because they can, then of course you're going to have inflation pressure points that will constrain your deficit spending capacity. And that kind of inflation risk is not going to be eliminated by austerity. It's not going to be eliminated by not spending. The only way to eliminate it is by taxing and regulating that abusive market power out of existence. In other words, you democratize your economy, right? Antitrust laws and taxation that is directed not at raising revenues, but at dismantling that abusive market power. So if you carefully assess the risk of inflation in each one of the pressure points that you have, inflation pressure points that you have in your economy, and target those inflation pressure points with strategic spending and taxation that builds additional productive capacity and democratizes the market structure that you have, then you've successfully increased your fiscal policy space and you've successfully increased the degree of your economic and monetary sovereignty. And those strategic decisions are made by who? They're made by your parliament, your Congress, your political authority. So fundamentally, this is a question about, do we have a government of the people, by the people, for the people, or a government for the corporation, by the corporations, by the super PACs, and for the super PAC? Because you're targeting abusive market power and you're trying to democratize economic structures. And that's fundamentally a core component of a democratic society. So that is the MMT lens and the paradigm shift that we're proposing here. And then you can use what I just described here in terms of this sort of obsession with the risk of inflation and targeting the inflation pressure points. You can use that in developed countries like the US, in developing countries in the global South. Fundamentally, it's the same analytical approach. It's the same lens that you use, but then the pressure points and the explanation for why certain sectors experience deficiencies or experience abusive market power, those are very different, for example, between the US and other developing countries. So that's the starting point for understanding MMT as far as I'm concerned.